Well, and yay, this Hangout on Air is now live. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to Chattering with Nicholas Vince. In a few moments, I'm going to introduce Ashley Thorpe. Before I do that, the usual thanks to everybody who's subscribed to the YouTube channel. Honestly, there's over 600 subscribers to the channel now, which I find amazing, which is really wonderful. Thank you so much. I can tell you something, a little bit of something, just to look out next week for some festival announcements for your appraisal. That's all I can tell you so far. But yeah, that's coming next week. And yeah, that's all I wanted to say, really. That's all I've got to shout out about this week. And so I can just introduce Ashley. Hi, Ashley.
Hello. Nice to be back.
Yes. And you're absolutely right. You do look as if you're in a passport photo booth.
Yeah. I'm actually kind of camped out in a train station photo booth. It'll be like the one in League of Gentlemen on at Christmas. So I'll just disappear through the floor like Sweeney Todd in a minute.
Yes. Well, we'll come back to League of Gentlemen and Reece Shearsmith later on when we're talking about Borley Rectory some more. Before we go any further, I know you've got a screening of Borley Rectory, and it's on February the 6th?
Yeah, February the 6th in Exeter, the Exeter Phoenix. And we had a screening there on November the 10th, I think it was. And it's my... The November the 10th one was my hometown screening. So it was quite nice because it sold out in about 48 hours, just gone straight away, which was lovely because it's nice knowing that people actually want to see it where I come from.
Right, yeah.
As opposed to being sick to death of hearing about it. Yeah, it was so popular they're showing it again. So tickets are on sale and they're already starting to fly out. So yeah, fingers crossed it'll sell out again.
Brilliant. So that's the Exeter Phoenix. We think it's at 8:30. Is that right?
Yeah, it starts at 8:30. Yeah, and the Phoenix, especially, the reason I chose the Exeter Phoenix was that it's an art centre, and I do a lot of work for them. I teach classes to young kids, teaching them how to do animation, like stop motion animation, the Aardman style things, and they were the venue that pretty much got me started again in filmmaking. So I regularly go back there. I have an obscene sense of loyalty to them because they helped me get started back again as a filmmaker back in about 2007. So, and I teach there every week. I teach children animation there every week. So I thought it was quite nice to, your only chance pretty much to see it in Devon is there. That's where you're going to see it. It's not going to be at View or anything like that. It's going to be at the Exeter Phoenix. So.
That's brilliant. So what age group do you teach?
It's a variety of ages, really. I mean, every Saturday morning I teach animation, and it's between about 7 and about 13. But I regularly travel out to primary schools as well and teach very, very young kids, like 5-year-olds, how to do very simple animations with clay and that kind of thing. So while I'm off doing the archly obscure and strange animations, at the weekends I'm pretty much living my Ray Harryhausen fantasies and making plasticine dinosaurs and things like that, and teaching other children how to get excited about it, really.
That's brilliant. That's really good. So what sort of camera do you use for that?
Very simple stuff. One of the things, when I run it with another Exeter animator called Graham Hayter, and we learned very quickly that, especially with young kids, that the trick is to get it set up very quickly, plug it in, play, and just get them going while they're excited about it. So it's we use what's it called, Stop Motion Pro, but we've used other things too. But a lot of the time we'll just use like a webcam, a USB webcam, plug it in, tape it down, set up their little scene for them, and just get them going, as opposed to spending half an hour setting it up. We just get it set up for them, plug it in, go, animate. You've got 3 hours to make as much as you can, kind of thing. So yeah, I love it. I love it because animation can be so it can become so technical and so dense. It's quite nice every Saturday playing, pretty much.
So how long? I mean, so how long do you have the kids for?
3 hours every Saturday morning, and it's about 10 of them. It's a busy, noisy old room. Put it that way. Anarchic.
I can imagine. And how much are you able to do in that 3 hours in terms of, you know, a finished animation? How much can you actually shoot?
Quite a lot, actually. I mean, the kids will quite often, they'll make, say, a 30-second animation, and obviously there's a lot of them, and we've only got 2 setups, so it's a constant switching around of places. But what often seems to happen is that certain children will come back. We do it in 4 to 6 week blocks, and quite often they'll make a scene every week, and they'll keep coming back month after month. And some of the kids have made like 3-4 minute long stop motion animations, and we teach them how to put sounds on them and titles and things, and they just keep coming back and adding to them, and then they make another one and another one. And some of the kids, I mean, there were some kids that they were being taught by me for like 6-7 years, and then they've just, you know, grown up. Their voices dropped, and they went off and started doing it at college. You know, and it's nice. It's nice, actually. You know, when they come along in the group and they're like 8, and then they literally grow and grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, and then they go off and start doing their own thing, and some of them have become, you know, little fledgling animators. So I love it. It's the easiest job in the world.
That's brilliant. That's really exciting. That's fun.
It is fun. I love it. I love it because, you know, the freelance work that I do is very kind of industrial and straight, and I've got like the industrial stuff, which is what pays the bills, and then I've got my project, which is, you know, my personal, insane, obsessional devotion stuff. You know, as you know. Yeah. And then at the weekends, it's right, and this is why I got into animation in the first place, and it's about monsters and teaching kids to be excited about the possibilities of it, and it's so much easier to do animation now than it was even when I started. Because when I started, it was at the beginning of that digital kind of revolution. The first films I made were shot in 16mm and cut on a Steenbeck. So I'm that old.
That was going to be the next question. How did you start? Yeah. Okay, so you shot it on 16 film. What did you do? Claymation, or what sort of filming? You know, what sort of animation did you do?
The first animation I made was at university, and it was a thing called Remain, and yeah, it was shot in 16mm, and it was very Svankmajer inspired, and it was about and Svankmajer and Clive Barker inspired, I have to say. As
right.
Anybody that watches it will go, it's really obvious, really obvious. It's very Hellraiser in some ways. It's obviously about this guy. He's about this guy he surrounds himself with all this kind of occult bric-a-brac, and he's got candles and skull pieces and lots of stuff from the seashore, things like barnacles and stuff around him. And then he does this painting in red oils, and he's mixing up these pigments and a skull, and as he adorns the canvas with them, the canvas comes to life. So I was animating paint, and then basically the canvas, in some sort of Faustian thing, sucks him into the canvas, so he kind of dissolves. So I wrapped up my poor actor in cellophane and painted over the cellophane, so he's basically like a wrapped up ham sandwich. And I just animated him kind of writhing around screaming, so you can only see his mouth out of this red mass. And then I cast bits of him in wax, and I stop motion melted it with blow torches and stuff, so his hands kind of go, which I didn't realise was all going to soak into the carpet. So God knows what my landlord felt when I left the place in Canterbury. But it was proper DIY stuff, and with great ambition and very obvious influences from Clive Barker and very Svankmajer. And that was the beginning of it, really. As soon as I had a go at it, I really got a bug for it. I fell in love with animation purely because you could cheat reality almost. You could things that would be very difficult to do in a traditional kind of live action setup. You could just you can cheat between frames in animation. You can make things appear and disappear and make something, turn something into something else. I mean, very much like the resurrection sequence in Hellraiser with Frank. And that's where I got the idea from, actually, this idea of filming things in reverse and melting things to make it look like they're coming together. And I pretty much did the opposite. I built it first and then melted it. So I very much got the, you know, the Bob Keane Frank sequence. I got the idea to do that, but I did it in reverse. So it all goes around, doesn't it? People from the best.
Hey, absolutely. And that's exactly how the guy started. In that. Okay, well, what works? What can we do? Oh, that's fascinating.
And what have we got? What have we got to hand? What can we do? We could cast things and we could melt them and run the film backwards. Yeah.
Brilliant. That's really, really fascinating. Okay, so
I got a reputation of being an absolute nutter as well very quickly at uni, because I was often seen coming back from the art block with black sacks full of cast body parts and things, lugging these things home.
Where did you study?
Canterbury.
Oh, lovely part of the world. Very, very.
Yeah.
And is it known for its animation, Canterbury?
Not really, no. When I wanted to do a film course, because I went to uni quite late. I worked for a few years after college and didn't really want to work that much. High Street, anyway. And so I went to college about sort of 22, 23. He chose the course based upon how much practical work was going to be involved, because I didn't want to go and learn film and fine art by reading books, because I thought, well, I can do that anyway. I want to go and do a practical fine art course where I paint, and I want to do a film course where I make films. And that was it. So I chose Canterbury because they seem to have the greatest amount of practical work. So I could just spend 3 years just making stuff as opposed to reading about what other people have been making, which I was doing anyway. So I thought I can do that in my spare time.
Okay. Oh, that really is interesting. Okay, so all this via a couple of other films led to Borley Rectory, and one of the films that you cited as a big influence on Borley Rectory, speaking in terms of just take them in the order the films were actually released. And the first one is The Innocence. When did you first see The Innocence?
Ooh. Do you know what? I genuinely can't remember the first time I saw it. It was one of those films that I think I read about its importance when I was a teenager and went back and revisited it. So I would have been about 17 or 18, I think. And I went back and revisited it and then realized that there was lots of stuff in that was familiar to me. So I would have seen it before, but not realized what it was. My whole life seems to be like that. I endlessly watch things and think, oh, so that's where that came from. I always wondered where that image came from. Glad I didn't pretend it was my own. It's like remembering song lyrics and you think you've made them up and then realize, oh no, I heard that when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And The Innocence was a bit like that. And I think that's why there's such an influence on my work as I got older, that I've always loved films that dealt in ambiguities. And one of the things I really loved about The Innocence was that, and it's a highly literate script for a start. Truman Capote wrote, I think, the final draft of it, or worked on the final draft. And it has this kind of cinematic web of influences. There's so many different things in there. And for a film that was made in the early 60s, it feels like a film made much earlier. When I think of The Innocence, it feels like a film made in the 40s. I don't know why. Maybe it's because it has this beautiful black and white photography, filmed by Freddie Francis. Beautiful, beautiful photography. And all the inside stuff has this expressionist feel about it. And all the external scenes have that kind of sun-baked, hazy, the dream of what a summer in childhood looks like. It's such a wonderful, evocative photography. And I just fell in love with it all over again. I watched it again recently, and I hadn't actually appreciated until I watched it about 3 or 4 months ago how much Borley Rectory was actually influenced by it. I knew it was an influence because the approach that the Innocence has to the ghosts especially, because I noticed in the Innocence that the edge of frame in the Innocence is often kept very hazy and indistinct. On the outside, there's lots of hazes and things, and on a lot of the internal shots, it is like it has this thick vignette around it. You very rarely see the edges of frame, so it has that weird feel as if you're constantly walking through the dark with a paraffin lamp. So I was thinking about that when I was making Borley Rectory, that to destroy the edges of the frame in some way or another. So you'll see, when you look at Borley, that there's often things obscuring the edges of the frame. There'll be blurred flowers up in front of stuff. There'll be furniture obscuring something on the insides. There'll be shadows, or there'll be a strong shaft of light obscuring where you can see where the character stood. And that the ghosts themselves in the Innocence are often, they don't appear smack bang in the middle of the screen. They're hidden behind a haze at the corner of frame, or you see them through dusty glass near the edge of frame. They're always obscured by something. And I actually read something that, I don't know whether it's just a story, but apparently Freddie Francis, when he was shooting certain scenes, especially the internal scenes, he actually smeared stuff or painted stuff on the lens itself to break down these edges.
Well, in fact, he didn't do the I happen to know this because there's a really, really good extra on the Sir Christopher Frayling, who I met very briefly recently, literally just to say hello.
He's a very nice guy.
Very nice.
Yeah, he's a nice guy.
Yes. It was who did a documentary. I mean, they got two old, I think he refers to them as two old ladies, but certainly two ladies who painted the vignettes on the lenses.
Right.
Because that was the only way to do it.
Yeah.
In those days. Now, I doubt if they, it's interesting, I doubt if they put it, he said lenses, but I suspect it probably wasn't the lens.
It was probably like a gauze in front.
It'll be a gauze, or it'll be glass. It would have been glass.
Yeah.
Placed over the lens, because you don't muck up your lens. Your lenses, you reuse them again, and you
ruined it.
Yeah. And besides, your screen's that shape, so you have an oval. If you put it on the lens, the moment you change your focus, the whole thing's going to go off.
All over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's how they got that effect. And you pointed absolutely. The other thing you mentioned is the fact that when you see the ghosts, you see Deborah Carr's reaction first.
Yeah.
Which means that it seeds in the audience the idea, is this real?
Yeah.
Whereas if you show the ghost and then somebody reacting, the convention is that thing is real, and now my character is reacting. But if you, and I'd never thought about this until I watched this documentary, and I thought that's really interesting, that this is the convention in cinema, that it basically, if you do it the other way around, you seed the audience.
Put questions in people's mind.
Yeah, as to whether or not it's real. And of course, you're referring to the fact that it was it's set in beautiful summertime.
Yeah.
They filmed it in autumn, October, so they had to ship in all these plants, all the flowers, and so on.
Yeah, and it was actually probably really cold.
It was, yeah, which makes you think, and sorry guys, there will be spoilers. I should have shouted.
Oh yeah, we should have said that.
Yeah, we should say so.
I have a very minor Borley spoiler here, which was the approach that Jack Clayton took with the Innocence. There's a couple of times with Marianne where she sees the ghost, and I did the exact same thing. That you'll see Marianne will go, and she'll look round, and then you see the ghost. And there are a couple of times, especially with Marianne, not so much with the other characters, but especially with Marianne, whose I don't know, genuine qualities are called into question regularly. that was a consideration.
Right.
And weirdly, some of my favourite bits in Borley are with Annabelle, and some of those moments where you're really not sure whether any of this is true whatsoever, any of it, because Marianne's such a mercurial character. You don't know whether anything that she's doing is genuine. So they were quite good fun to make those bits.
Right.
So again, that was that ambiguity of the innocence, that you're experiencing a ghost story through somebody else's perceptions, and very clearly through their perceptions. And I find that kind of material wonderful, because it makes you endlessly rewatch it and look at it and think, what am I seeing here? And the fact that it has that that opening with the songs of the Willow Mary.
Oh yes. Child.
And it starts off with these titles coming up, and with the praying hands coming up in the shot, and that's absolutely copied, hook, line, and sinker at the beginning of Borley. For that reason, because I wanted people to. I mean, it doesn't have the child singing, but it starts off with the nun's hands coming into prayer, and that's the first thing you see: the praying hands and the weeping.
It's really interesting, because it actually starts in blackness. And I remember seeing it at the BFI and just thinking, what's happened to the picture? All I can hear is
wonderful. They even get rid of the 20th Century Fox fanfare.
Yes.
Which was unheard of at that time, absolutely unheard of. And you're just sat there in the dark listening to this child singing. And that's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
If I'd had the balls, I would have done something similar.
But people just think it's broken. That's
they do. They do. That's so weird. It'd be lovely to just break those things. Wasn't there some sort of warning that went out with The Last Jedi? Where there's that lovely bit towards the end where the rebellion ship smashes into the...
Oh no, don't tell me about this. I haven't seen this. No.
I won't ruin anything. No. But there's this lovely bit where, to emphasise the fact that one giant ship has crashed into the other one, all the sound drops to complete dead silence as you see this thing plow into the other one. And because there were so many people that questioned that, some of the theatres were apparently having to put out a warning saying there was supposed to be a quiet bit near the end of the film. It's not broken. And
it's
what are you supposed to do?
Well, the trouble is, it is a very brave thing. I don't know how, because then all you get to hear is, during your big spaceship crash or whatever's going on, is people eating popcorn or snuffling or shifting in their seats. It's like, cinemas are not quiet places.
Not very quiet places, no.
I mean, I remember seeing Indiana Jones, the first one, in Leicester Square in the Empire, and the original, yeah, and sitting down at the very front, and literally everyone just being absolutely mesmerized by the opening of Indiana Jones and the.
I remember seeing it at the cinema as well, and
yeah,
just and then watching it like that.
Yeah.
Oh no, it's so horrible.
But it's like cinemas are noisy places these days. The people that and people checking their phones, etc.
Oh,
but anyway, I'm not going to do grumpy old man about that. But I just it's very, yeah. I think it's a very brave move on his behalf to actually do that at the beginning of the Innocence. Shelley, thank you very much for your question. I have got your question. Craig has passed it on. I will ask Ashley in a few moments. Actually, we've been talking a bit about Borley Rectory, and before we move on to the next film you incited, we'll ask Shelley's question. Shelley's question was, what made you want to write a film about Borley Rectory?
Yeah. Well, I think it was... when I came back to my hometown after spending years and years trying to get into the industry in different ways and doing this, that, and the other, and just kind of getting fed up with it, really, the first thing I did when I kind of came back, I thought, right, I'm going to dedicate myself to telling the stories, purely telling the stories that I want to hear. And it became ironically, it felt like a selfish thing at the time. It was also a declaration of intent, I think, as if I'm just going to do what I want to do now. I've done my, I'm not that young a man anymore. I've done my running around after the industry. I'm going to do what I want to do now. And so I dedicated myself, certainly in my own work, to just telling stories which I felt were neglected, things which I couldn't believe that people hadn't told these stories before. So you got Scarecrow about the highwayman. It's like, what's going on? Where's all the stories about highwaymen? I loved highwaymen when I was a kid. The pirates thing came back, which is great. But there were no highwaymen, so I'm going to do highwaymen. We did Screaming Skull, which I thought was a really interesting idea. This idea of like bone-locked spirits. We had films about dolls, spirits locked in dolls, but I always thought the idea of a screaming skull, this thing that was so rooted in your family history, hereditary madness, all these sorts of things. And I thought, nobody's making this. I'll make one. Hairy Hands, that was again embracing Dartmoor myths. Again, why is nobody making films about Dartmoor myths? And then after that, it was something I discovered again while reading about Screaming Skulls and things, that I realized that nearly every single ghost story book that I had when I was a child had mention of this place, Borley Rectory. Every single one, including the very first ghost book that I had, which was the Osborne Book of Ghosts. And it had this lovely, it had 2 double-page spreads dedicated to it. In fact, I bet you've got it here. Here we go.
Oh,
it never leaves my side. Let's have a look, just to prove I still have it. This isn't my original one, I don't think, but it had 2. There you go. So that is what I remember from when I was a kid. It was that double-page spread of the story told in pictures. All the famous happenings. And the other part of it was this cross-section, which showed you what happened room by room, floor by floor. And that stuff absolutely blew my mind when I was a kid. And it absolutely terrified me, this idea that this thing was the Mount Everest of haunted houses. Anything that had this moniker, the most haunted house in England, I thought, God, that's terrifying. And that it didn't have one ghost. It had messages being written on the walls. It had cold spots. It had a phantom nun. It had a monk. It had mysterious shadowy hands that would grab and slap people out of the dark. It had a phantom coach and horses. Anything you can think of, this place had it. And it was when I was reading for Screaming Skull that I remembered all this stuff, and then thought, well, why hasn't anybody made a film about Borley Rectory? It's like the British Amityville, but with even more going on. And I found it absolutely baffling, because it seemed not only was it a great melting pot of lots and lots of gothic horrors, and they are very gothic. They're very, when you look at them, it is very much like it's a bit like the Monster Squad of ghosts. It's all the classics: the monk, the nun, the this, the that. The coach and horses. You couldn't be more traditional, really. But also, it represented the birth of the ghostbusting era. It was this moment when science blended with paranormal investigation, and haunted houses started being investigated as a scientific endeavor, as opposed to, we're going to send in the medium and see what signals they get. Harry Price was a self-labeled scientist, and he went in there with equipment like a ghostbusting kit and with volunteers, and it was the beginning of a new type of paranormal investigation, and its influence was huge. You can see it in The Haunting of Hill House. You can see it in Matheson's Hell House. It's all that stuff. It's all in there, and the more I read about it, I just couldn't understand why nobody had tried to make something of it. So I thought, well, I'll have a go at it. And very tricky it was too, because there's so much to try and condense into this thing. There's 60 years worth of good material in there, from say the late Victorian period through to when it burnt down in the mid-40s. There's so much that happens there that my film really, I think, serves as an introduction to it. You could make an entire HBO series. You could probably make an entire HBO series just about Ann Forrester. But there's so much material in there.
Marianne, which one was Marianne?
Marianne was the wife of the Reverend Forrester, and she was the one that saw writing to her written on the Rectory walls.
Yes.
And she added,
yeah.
"No, I can't understand, please tell me more," and the ghost would write underneath. But there were lots of rumours that a lot of that might have been, the bumps in the night might have been covering up illicit affairs.
Yes.
And the bumps might have been coming from something else. Yes, to say. Which I very clearly allude to in the film as well.
Yes.
There's a very dry joke in there about that.
Yeah, Mellors the gardener. Yeah. Shelley just wanted, so the book that we're talking about is the Usborne Book of Ghosts.
Yeah, it's the Usborne Book of Ghosts, and it's a children's book. It was. I mean, I did a lot of reading afterwards. I especially read a lot of stuff that was written by Harry Price himself, and in fact, my script was based very much on Harry Price's point of view of his investigations. But the drive to make the film very much came from a book that I read when I was about 8. It really was. It was just something that stuck in there in my mind, you know, a bit like the old public safety films when you're a kid. They're just images that stick in your mind and they never really go away.
Yeah.
So, and it just came back and thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to try and tell this very dense historical story with lots of characters coming and going, to try and tell it quite visually and quite sincerely, I think, as well, and try to discuss why, at the same time, try to discuss why ghost stories fascinate us so much.
It's interesting, because I think this kind of brings us to your second choice of film, which is Wisconsin Death Trip, which
Yes.
I'd seen The Innocence. I'd never heard of Wisconsin Death Trip, and is absolutely fascinating. Drama documentary, and basically a series of vignettes of stories, you know, just stories.
Yeah. So have you seen it now?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It was something, again, this was one of these things that I think I kind of rediscovered by accident. This one was purely by chance. I think that The Innocence was something that was probably on quite regularly in the 70s on television, but this was something that I think Arena on BBC, put it out one evening, and as a student back in, I think it was at college, I don't think it was at uni, I was still quite young. I discovered it purely by chance, absolutely by chance. You know, I sat down, probably had to do something, and then got hopelessly distracted by the television. Back on the days where you only had 4 channels, mind as well.
Oh, listen, I grew up on the TV. We weren't allowed to watch the commercial channel. We only watched the BBC.
ITV.
That's the commercial channel. My parents, we watched, and then you had the vertical hold. So you had to run around the back of the set and twiddle with the knob to make.
Oh, the one by the curtain. Yeah, I said that. That's great.
Yeah.
So it was purely by chance. I switched on one evening on BBC Two, and this thing, I was lucky, I caught it right at the very beginning, and this thing started that had this beautiful, again, black and white photography, and I didn't know at the time, but it was based upon a book that came out in the early 70s, I think by Michael Levy, Michael Lessie, I think it was, and he'd made this this book that was just based upon historical records of, I think, sort of like births, marriages, deaths, crime reports in this Wisconsin town over a certain period. And the film that was made in the 90s, I think it was 1999, it's by James Marsh. I remember the narration by Ian Holm. And it tried to very much invoke these very eerie photographs from that period, of these quite photographs of people from that period. The faces look so different to photographs of people nowadays. I mean, it was a much harder time and a harder life, and the maps of these people's faces, you look at them and think of their experiences, and they're just very eerie to behold anyway. But then the fact that the newspaper reports that accompanied these pictures was, a lot of them only like 4 lines. And I got hopelessly drawn into this documentary, or whatever it was I was supposed to be doing. I think I probably did absolutely nothing at all. If I was writing something, I probably wrote about 3 lines or something. And I was absolutely, utterly bewitched by this thing, because in terms of its format as being a documentary, it threw everything that I took for granted to the wind, utterly. I mean, it was very clearly a documentary. It was very clearly based upon fact and about factual resources. But the stories were told through these beautifully recreated reenactments, through beautiful photography, and the fact that when it had narration by Ian Holm, but a lot of the material was the characters saying it in their own voices, and it was obviously based upon contemporary accounts. And it was such an interesting way of evoking the past. I found it absolutely riveting. There were moments where it leapt to the modern day, and with it being Wisconsin, they inevitably touched upon Ed Gein and the Ed Gein murders and things, which were discussed by teenagers who would dare themselves to go back to the murder sites and things. But I just remember being absolutely fascinated, and it obviously made a huge impact without me really realising it. Because over the next 20 years, I'd get into discussions with people and say, "Oh, you should check out Wisconsin Death Trip. It's really interesting." And I'd buy it for filmmaker friends and things as presents and whatnot, and not realising that I'd eventually make something that was so obviously lurking in its shadow. Really obviously lurking in its shadow. I found that there was something that James Marsh said. I read something about him when I got more and more interested in it, that said that he really wanted to. He found that he wanted to evoke that kind of that sincerity and pathos that came from the almost the throwaway means in which these little 4-line captions that would come underneath these people's photographs, which were records of their lives, the beginning of their lives and the passing of their lives. And he wanted to evoke the pathos and wonder of a life summarized in 4 lines. And I thought that was a really interesting way to try and do that. So when it came to Borley, and the fact that I was very lucky to have a wealth of contemporary photographs of inside and the outside of the rectory, I thought, this is it. This is obviously this is the way I need to do it. There's no point trying to do it in terms of it being a very traditional documentary. I should try to evoke something similar. I should try to evoke something a bit more unusual, and treat the reenactments not in the way that quite often they are in traditional documentaries, and make it more of like a docudrama. I mean, Wisconsin Death Trip, in some ways, you could say it's a docudrama, because it's not somebody just saying this happened and that happened and that happened. You see these things playing out as a drama, and then almost the narration reminds you that you're watching a documentary. And it's very different.
It is very different. I did find it interesting. I liked some of the characters, particularly the lady who constantly
breaks the windows.
Breaks the defenestration, I believe, is the technical term. Which a word that's just come into my head.
That's very good.
Yeah,
I couldn't remember it.
Yeah, defenestration.
Breaking windows.
Breaking windows. Yeah, and they do, come back to these characters, and also, but the opera singer. The story of the opera, amazing, it's a heartrending story, really, which you get to, but also, as you say, I think it's the real understanding of it was a tough life, but also these were tough people as well, who, and it's interesting to speculate perhaps, or think about, as to whether it was the toughness of the life that made them behave in certain ways, or the reason why they were out on the frontiers is because there was no room for them in
Perhaps, yeah.
Yeah.
They couldn't assimilate so much.
Yeah, yeah. It's absolutely fascinating document. As I say, lots of different stories.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it's a a cast of dozens and dozens of different characters, but there's this wonderful thing that weaves through them, which both evokes where they're living and the time in which they're living. But also, there's this idea of, is this place cursed by madness? And it almost implies that by putting this thing about Ed Gein on the end. Why in this particular area? Is it the remoteness? Or is it the sculpted, this series of events? I mean, it alludes, I think, in the documentary to the fact that some of it might have been attributed to ergot poisoning, infected wheat and whatnot. But I love it. I was absolutely fascinated by it. And like the Innocence, when it came to make my own thing, I think that all of these things had just been fermenting away over the years. And I think that's why when it came to make Borley, it never felt like a consideration. I don't ever remember sitting down and thinking, I'm going to make a ghost story. It's going to be inspired by that, that, and that, and I'm going to have a bit of that, a bit of that, a bit of that. All this stuff just coalesced, and it felt like the only way to do it was this. And it's only in retrospect that I've sat down and looked at it and thought, oh yeah, of course, that's where that comes from. Of course, I was, obviously from the moment in 1999 that I sat down and watched Wisconsin Death Trip, somewhere in the background I thought, I'm going to make a documentary like that.
Yeah,
that's really interesting. I'm going to try and apply that. And it was never like an artfully considered thing. I think that's why I've been trying to be so vocal with people and say that was such a big influence, but I only realised it when I was editing it together and thought that's where that comes from. That's why it grew into this docudrama, because I could have done it with very straight reenactments and done it in a very similar way. Like, a lot of these paranormal shows, I could have just done it like that, like a History Channel thing, but didn't. I wanted it to be a ghost story that hopefully had a bit of pathos about the characters in it, but also was a bit scary occasionally, that was atmospheric, and you get to the end of it and you hopefully feel a little bit haunted by it, because you can kind of see what the characters were bringing to that place. You move into a place that's famous to be haunted.
It's interesting. There's a couple of things. Derek, hi Derek, says he remembers an album by Static X called Wisconsin Death Trip.
Yeah.
But also you mentioned ergot poisoning.
Yeah.
I've seen a documentary where they were giving it as a reason for the Salem witch trials.
Yeah.
Because basically, people seeing animals and cats and mythic, basically having delusions, is a result of ergot poisoning, which comes from damp wheat baked into bread. I also remember that I was looking at the shelves just to see, somewhere I have a comic done by a gentleman called John Bolton.
Oh yeah, John Bolton.
Yeah,
isn't there a picture of you done by John Bolton?
Oh, there's a few. There are a few. There's behind one of them's behind the curtain, but John did a short comic, basically where he was suggesting that Bruegel might have got his visions from, wondering if Bruegel got his visions from ergot poisoning. And I'm trying to think, there's another artist who's known for these wonderful visions of hell, with bloated bladders walking around on legs and so on. Yes, might be a result of ergot poisoning. Wisconsin Death Trip, really interesting documentary. I'm glad I got to see that. So we know it took you a long time. How long officially did it take you to get Wally?
40 years.
40 years.
Let me think. We recorded Julian Sands' narration at Christmas 2011. So, yeah. So that was the first thing that we did. And then our funding fell through. And then the project spent 2 years in limbo. And that's when we did the Indiegogo in 2013 to get the first shoot done in 2014. And then I made about 10 minutes of it, did a second Indiegogo, and then completed the shooting in 2015. And then I animated it solid from 2015 until the end of September 2017.
Wow.
So it was pretty much every, to be honest, since that first shoot in 2014, I've spent every evening and every weekend animating it until about September 20th last year, including Christmases.
Just sounds like Clive.
It very much became this thing that I got used to doing. This Christmas, the Christmas just passed, was really strange because it's the first Christmas in about 3 years that I hadn't spent my evenings sat in front of Borley Rectory and just animating. I was actually able to sit down and just stare at my reflection in the mirror thinking, I've got nothing to do. This is really strange. What shall I do? Oh, I could watch Wisconsin Death Trip. I've just been trying to do everything else that I hadn't been doing the other time. But yeah, it was a constant. It was a lot of work.
So in terms of, and we've spoken about this on the show before, but you mentioning within 3 hours with the kids, you know, you get some. How on average, how much were you able to do of an evening? How long was it take?
Yeah. Well, my wife works nights. She works from about sort of 3 p.m. until sometimes about 11, 12 o'clock at night. So what I would do is that I've got a young daughter. She's 3. She hadn't even been born when I first started the project. Just a sobering thought. She's grown up with it. She calls it Daddy's stupid film. Just to keep me in my place. Doing your stupid film again, Daddy. Yes, I am. I would put my daughter to bed. I mean, she was a newborn when I first started animating, so you can imagine how much start, stop it is. I'd get my daughter to sleep, usually by about 8:30, and then I would work through until I was exhausted, and then I'd go to bed. Then I'd be up at relatively early in the morning. So I'd get, on average, I'd probably get about 4 or 5 hours a night for about at least 2.5 years, I'm saying. And then weekends I'd get to do more than that.
So in that 4.5 hours, what length of film time were you able to achieve?
It varied. It really varied. It depends on the complexity of the shot. Some shots were very easy to do. Shots where the actors were stood in front, were just talking to each other in front of a background. It would just be the length that it took to make the background in Photoshop, digitally paint into it, and then it's just a case of screening out the actors and adding them to it and rotoscoping over it a bit. So some of those shots were quite easy. A shot like the pop-up book, the rectory popping up out of the pop-up book things, or some of the aerial shots of the rectory, which are based upon a 3D model, so I could see what it would have looked like, because obviously there's no aerial shots of what the rectory looked like, but that's based upon an elevation of the floor plans, so I could actually put a camera up and see what the rectory would have looked like from if you flew over it in a drone kind of thing. Those shots took ages. You know, some of those shots took me 2 weeks to do, because one, I was only getting to work on them, say 3, 4, 5 hours a night, but because everything had to be built, it had to be built. Nothing in that's real. It's all created from scratch in Photoshop. I had to animate all the rain, 3D, After Effects animation. You know, you start off animating the rain by generating the globule that you're going to use to make the rain drop. So you start off from nothing, build up to the point where you're compositing all the stuff together. So yeah, some shots took me 2 weeks. the pop-up book shot, I mean, a good 2 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah, so I mean, it really varied on the complexity of the shot.
And for those of you who've not seen Borley Rectory, you mentioned Rotoscope. So basically, it's a mixture of live action, because obviously I spent a really wonderful day with you guys in front of a green screen. and reaching for
nothing.
Reaching for a doorknob that wasn't there.
Yeah.
Reaching towards the screen tremulously, reaching for a doorknob that wasn't there. So it's a mixture of live action and rotoscope.
Yes.
And for those people who don't know the term rotoscope, what does that mean?
It means you take the original film that you've made and you basically paint over it or into it. The best example I can give of something like rotoscoping would be something like a Scanner Darkly, or like the films of Ralph Bakshi used a lot of rotoscoping, where they would film almost guide tracks and then it'd be painted over. You can see in a lot of the original Disney films, especially when you go back to films like Snow White, you can really see that the animation had that kind of guide track. Just the animation of not so much the dwarves, because you can see that they're animated from scratch, but if you look at how Snow White moves, it looks like a living, breathing person underneath that animation. And they had that kind of guide track as a rotoscope. And Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings was a huge influence on me when I first started, especially with Scarecrow, because I wanted Scarecrow to look like the Black Riders in Lord of the Rings. I mean, they were all rotoscoped.
Yes, and for those who don't know, this is basically the first.
A long time ago.
It's a long time ago. It was
78.
78.
I think. Yeah, I think it was.
I remember seeing it in the cinema and going, "Oh wow, but this is not what I expected at all."
It's very strange. Very strange.
I remember John Hurt is in it.
It's Aragorn.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this is weird. And I'd never seen anything
very
like
strange. No, likewise. I really didn't know what to make of it when I saw it as a kid, because I was mad about Tolkien as a kid. And then when I saw it, I wasn't sure whether I loved it or whether I disliked it. I couldn't make my mind up, but I suddenly realised I was watching it every other day for weeks on end. So I guess I made my mind up at some point. But I think I was just fascinated by the fact that it wasn't live action and it wasn't traditional animation. It was something in between. And I ended up finding myself doing something similar when I started making my own animations, almost by accident. I think that a lack of equipment and a lack of traditional disciplines made me just fall into this technique. And then I realized what I was doing by accident. So I thought, I'm kind of doing what he was doing, nowhere near as sophisticated, but doing something similar purely because it seemed like the only way that I could blend these disciplines together and also convey what I wanted to create. Somewhere between fact and fiction, so rotoscope seemed perfect.
And I think the thing I also remember about it is that it only tells half the story of the first book.
Yeah, they get about halfway through the Two Towers, I think, and then it doesn't get any further. And I don't think he was allowed to carry on with it.
No, there was no.
So much time and so much money trying to get this thing made, and it didn't make enough money when it came out. So that was it. Lord of the Rings didn't get looked at again until Peter Jackson stabbed it.
Yeah.
Although it's interesting actually, because when you look at the ring wraith sequence, the first ring wraith sequence, where the hobbits get off the road and they hide underneath the roots of that gnarly old tree by the side of the road. Jackson, there's so many ways he could have done that, but Jackson shoots that almost shot for shot as Bakshi did it. Almost shot for shot when you watch how you look at them side by side. And I think that was a very good choice, because that's a really strong scene in the animation. And I was really happy, weirdly, when I saw that the Jackson one was going, you knew when something's, if it's not broke,
yeah,
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, really good.
Yeah. You're not filching it. This is homage. Yeah.
Yeah, and it just seemed like, we got it right, so let's do the same. Let's do the same. And in actual fact, I still think the animation one is a bit more powerful in that scene. So there's a can of worms to open up online.
Just had a message through from the Welsh reviewer Shelley. I thought thought Borley Rectory was absolutely fantastic. Just editing my review of it. So there'll be another review. We've got 5 minutes left.
Okay.
And we thought we wouldn't have enough to talk about.
We could go on for hours.
We usually do. What else? So you've mentioned the screening in Exeter. What else is happening with Borley at the moment?
Well, Tom and I cut a trailer together for it last night. It sounds ridiculous, we've been in festivals. We've had about 12 screenings. We haven't cut a trailer together yet. That's how close to the wire it was getting it out. So we cut a proper trailer together last night, which looks good. But we've drawn up a list of about 30, 40 festivals we're going to push it into this year. We've started getting interest from distributors in terms of getting it out and into shops and things. So we're going to do a tour and then look at our options and right at the end of the year kind of thing. So we've got grand plans getting it out there to festivals in the UK and all over the place, really. America, across Europe, all sorts. Get it out as much as possible. It's time to leave the animator's chair and go out into the world.
Have you got anything else that you're working on at the moment?
I have ideas. I have lots of ideas for other projects. But I was approached by a very, very good screenwriter at the Cast and Crew screening in London, actually, and he's very interested in me adapting one of his screenplay stroke novellas, and the subject material is very much up my street and very much linked to a lot of my influences, and that's about all I can say about it at this time. Okay, that seems fair enough. It's a departure in some ways, and in other ways, it's not.
But hopefully it won't mean missing 3 more Christmases.
No.
I'm not going to do that again.
Can't do that again.
No, you can't make me.
I'll have a team working with me. If I ever do something like that again, I will have a team that will work with me. It won't just be me doing all the animation. It's crazy.
No. I just have hugest respect that you've actually managed to, achieved this amazing result just by yourself.
Thank you. I mean, there was, I tried to. I mean, I did the animation myself, but there was a lot of people involved in bringing it to screen. People like Tom, my producer, and Alice, and all the cast and crew and stuff. I mean, it wouldn't be made without them. Yourself included in that.
Thank you.
I couldn't have done it without all the people that came in and made that side of it a reality.
Reese and Julian and
absolutely,
and Jonathan and so on.
Yeah, so Martin Pavey did an amazing sound mix on it, which just absolutely elevated it beyond anything I've ever done before, or could have hoped for. But it's often emphasised that it's just me sat in a room, but it was for about 2 years. But the important beginning bit and the bit at the end where all that stuff coalesced, it couldn't have happened without a big team of very great people I'm very grateful for, and too.
Cool, excellent. All right then. Well, we look forward to the next thing. And if you haven't seen Borley Rectory and you have a chance to go and see it, do. I really love it. It is an atmosphere. It's not like you have to sit there and just really look at the screen and try and work out what is going on.
It's very much a sum of my influences, I think. From lots, not just the 2 films that I've spoken about tonight, although when you watch it you'll see there's a lot of that in there, but it's a bit of a format busting animated documentary, I suppose. It's a docudrama, ghost story.
Yeah, that seems fair enough to me. That seems fair enough. Ashley, thank you. Just before we say goodbye, I just wanted to let people know that over the next couple of weeks, and I'm not quite sure which day, the next 3-4 weeks, I do have some other. There are shows for the next few weeks. John Schnitzer, who is the director of the Haunters documentary, which is all about Halloween attractions. He's going to be joining me. Stephen Cognetti, director of Hell House LLC, which is a found footage. And again, something, a labor of love done by Stephen. Got quite a few other people lined up. Almost getting ready to get through most of my way through February in terms of the guests, which is amazing for me.
You're all booked up.
Yeah. But yeah, so and as I say, there should be more news coming out this week about your appraisal, and yeah, which is I'm really excited about. Ashley, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure, and apologies about last time. That was just an absolute nightmare. That was terrible.
That's fine. It's fine. It's, you know, me waffling away for half an hour. It's all right.
I got here in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, folks. This has been Chattering with Nicholas Vince. I've been talking with Ashley Thorpe about his feature film, Borley Rectory, which is on the festival circuit at the moment. I will hopefully see some of you next week. Look out for announcements during the week as to the guests who are coming up. And in the meantime, stay calm, stay cool, and stay spooky. And